Captain Leo Lawson was not used to surprises. As a seasoned soldier, he had faced countless challenges, from violent alien species to treacherous political missions. But this new assignment was different. It came from the highest authority in the galaxy, the Galactic Alliance. Leo stood in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, his boots echoing softly on the marble floor. Around him, alien species from various corners of the universe sat at their grand curved tables. Most of them towered over him, their faces stern and unreadable. But one presence filled the room with power, the alien Queen Xerox. Queen Xerox was a legend. Her species was fierce and proud, ruling a vast empire with strength and cunning. She was feared across the galaxy, and even Leo, a human soldier, had heard stories about her unmatched leadership. But today, it was not her strength that brought him here. It was her daughter, Princess Elira. The Queen's voice rang out, deep and commanding. "Captain Lawson," she began, her tone cold, "you have been chosen for a unique mission. My daughter, Princess Elira, needs guidance, and it is you who will provide it." Leo blinked in confusion. He had been sent on many missions, but none like this. He was a soldier, a strategist. He was not a tutor for royal children. "Guidance? From me?" Leo asked, his voice steady but filled with surprise. "Your daughter is, well, she's a princess. Shouldn't she have a tutor from her own kind?" Xerox's piercing gaze did not falter. "Elira is a special case. She is not like other rulers. Her mind is sharp, but her heart—" The Queen paused, her gaze growing dark. "Her heart is still untamed. She is not ready to rule." Leo shifted on his feet. He wasn't sure what to say. He had no idea what kind of mentor the Queen was expecting him to be. "I do not want her to become a ruler who uses power recklessly," Xerox continued. "I want her to learn the value of diplomacy, strategy, and patience. That is where you come in. You, a human, will teach her what she needs to know. You will stay with her, guide her in ways she cannot learn from her own people." Leo took a deep breath. It wasn't his usual style to refuse orders, especially not from someone as powerful as Queen Xerox. But this task seemed impossible. The princess was known to be wild, temperamental, and uninterested in following anyone's commands. And now Leo was expected to teach her. "I'll do it," Leo finally said, though doubt still lingered in his mind. He was a soldier, after all, not a teacher. But there was no turning back now. The Queen nodded. "You leave immediately. Her ship is waiting for you." The journey to Elira's homeworld was fast, the sleek ship cutting through the stars at unimaginable speeds. Leo couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as they traveled across the galaxy. His mission was far from what he expected, but the prospect of working with royalty was intriguing. When the ship landed on Elira's home planet, Leo was greeted by the sight of towering palace walls and an enormous garden of alien plants. Everything around him was grand and mysterious, yet there was an uncomfortable air about the place. It was as though the planet was not made for humans. A servant guided him to the palace's royal chambers. When they entered, Leo was met with a sharp, cool gaze from Princess Elira herself. Elira was young, maybe in her early 20s, and her appearance was as regal as her title. She had flowing dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that seemed to pierce through Leo. Her posture was strong, and she carried herself with an undeniable air of superiority. "You must be the human," she said, her voice icy. "What is it that you are supposed to teach me?" Leo stood tall, meeting her gaze. He was used to facing people who thought they were above him, but something about Elira made him wary. He was a soldier, and his experience had taught him to be cautious with people like her. "I am here to help," Leo replied, keeping his voice steady. "Your mother believes that you could benefit from learning diplomacy, how to lead with wisdom, and how to understand the value of your actions beyond your power." Elira smirked. "I don't need a human to teach me how to rule. My people have power beyond your understanding." Leo had expected this reaction, but he was prepared. "It's not just about power," It's about knowing when to use it and when to hold back. The princess's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Leo thought she might dismiss him outright. But instead, she turned and walked toward the window, looking out at the sprawling gardens below. "Fine," she said after a long pause. "You can stay, but don't think you can change me. I am who I am, and no human can teach me otherwise." Leo nodded, accepting the challenge. This wasn't going to be easy, but if there was one thing humans were known for, it was their ability to adapt, and he would need all his skills to survive in this strange new world. The journey had just begun, and Leo Lawson was already beginning to realize that Elira's lesson might be more than just about diplomacy. It might be about understanding the true nature of power. The days that followed Leo's arrival on Elira's home planet were filled with tension. From the moment he set foot in her grand palace, it was clear that Elira had no interest in his presence. As far as she was concerned, humans were primitive, weak, and certainly not qualified to teach her anything. But Leo wasn't easily discouraged. He had faced challenges far more difficult than this. At breakfast the next morning, Leo sat at the long, elegant table, staring at the strange food before him. The alien dishes were colorful and full of strange textures, many of which Leo couldn't even identify. He tried to appear polite as he picked up a fork, though he wasn't sure how to eat some of the foods. Elira, sitting across from him, watched with a raised eyebrow as Leo poked at his meal. "I assume you're not used to this," she said coldly, her eyes scanning him with amusement. Leo glanced at her. "I'm not. But that doesn't mean I can't learn," he said, his voice calm but firm. Elira smiled faintly, but there was no kindness in it. "I doubt there's anything to learn from eating this. It's just food," she said, her voice dripping with arrogance. Leo wasn't surprised by her attitude. He'd dealt with much worse in his career. But it was clear that Elira didn't understand that diplomacy was about more than just power. It was about understanding others, respecting their differences, and finding common ground. Elira seemed to think that being a royal princess meant she could dismiss everyone she didn't find useful. Leo would have to change that. After breakfast, Leo suggested they begin their lessons. He had read a lot about the culture of Elira's people before arriving, hoping to gain some insight into their customs and values. The first lesson was meant to be simple, understanding the basics of human diplomacy. But Elira was not interested. She barely even listened to him. "You want me to talk to other species like they're my equals," she said, clearly annoyed. "I'm a princess. I don't need to negotiate with anyone. If I want something, I take it." Leo sighed. He had expected her to feel this way, but it didn't make the situation any easier. "That might work for a time, but it won't always," he said. "Your mother, the queen, is powerful, but even she needs allies. Without them, she would have fallen long ago. Diplomacy isn't about weakness. It's about strength through cooperation." Elira stared at him, clearly unconvinced. "You speak as if humans know something no one else does. You're weak. Your species is known for getting involved in wars and conflicts you can't win. What makes you think I'll learn anything from a human?" Leo's patience was tested, but he kept his cool. The fact that humans survive and adapt. No matter how many battles we lose, we never give up. And that's why we're still here, while many other species have been wiped out. You can learn a lot from us, if you're willing to listen. Elira stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "I don't need a lecture. I'm a princess. I was born to rule." She walked away without another word. Leo sat there for a moment, his hands folded on the table. He had expected resistance, but Elira's arrogance was more than he had anticipated. She didn't just think she was above him. She thought she was above everyone. This wasn't going to be an easy mission. Over the next few days, Leo tried again and again to engage Elira in lessons, but she would either dismiss him or mock his efforts. He tried teaching her the art of negotiation, but she refused to consider anyone else's opinion. He taught her the importance of patience, but she lost her temper at the slightest disagreement. One afternoon, they were in the palace gardens. Elira had taken to wandering there alone, lost in thought, while Leo tried to get her to understand the value of listening to others. He knew she was capable of more, but her pride and sense of superiority made it hard to reach her. "Your people may be powerful, but power without wisdom is dangerous," Leo said as they walked through the lush garden. Elira glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "I don't need to hear this from you. I can command entire armies. What makes you think your words matter?" Leo stopped walking and looked her in the eyes. "Because I've seen what happens when power is used carelessly. I've seen entire civilizations fall because their rulers thought their strength made them invincible. Your power isn't the only thing that will keep you safe." Elira didn't respond immediately. She walked ahead, her back turned to Leo, and for a moment, he thought she wasn't listening. But then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I don't want to be weak. I don't want to be like those other leaders who rely on others. I want to be strong, like my mother." Leo couldn't help but feel a sense of understanding. She wasn't completely closed off. Beneath her arrogance, there was a fear of being weak, a fear of losing control. Maybe she wasn't as confident as she seemed. "You don't have to be weak to be a good leader," Leo said, his voice softening. "Strength isn't just in the power to control others. It's in the wisdom to know when to act, when to listen, and when to walk away from a fight." Elira stopped walking and turned to look at him. There was a moment of silence between them, and for the first time, she seemed to consider his words. "I'll think about it," she said before turning away again. "But that doesn't mean I'll listen to everything you say." Leo smiled. At least she was thinking about it. That was progress. Days passed, and Leo's patience was beginning to wear thin. Princess Elira still refused to accept the lessons he tried to teach her. She seemed determined to ignore his advice, convinced that her natural abilities and royal status were enough to ensure her success. However, Leo began to notice something strange, something Elira wasn't willing to show anyone else. It started subtly during one of their training sessions. Leo had suggested they practice negotiation skills in a simulated environment, where they had to work with an alien envoy. Elira, as usual, wasn't interested. She had only agreed to join because she wanted to prove she could handle it without Leo's help. The simulation was supposed to be straightforward, but things quickly escalated when the envoy made a demand that Elira didn't like. The alien leader, a tall and imposing creature, spoke with a tone of superiority. He demanded that Elira's planet send resources, threatening war if they refused. Leo was watching carefully, waiting for Elira to handle the situation diplomatically. But what happened next surprised him. Instead of calmly negotiating, Elira's eyes narrowed, and her body tensed as though she were about to explode with rage. Before Leo could intervene, Elira raised her hand. The alien envoy froze mid-sentence, his face contorted with fear. It was as if the air around them had thickened, and his body was locked in place, unable to move. The alien's eyes widened in shock, and Leo could feel an eerie stillness fill the room. What are you doing?" Leo asked, his voice filled with both surprise and concern. Elira slowly lowered her hand, and the alien envoy snapped out of his trance, stumbling back in fear. He looked at Elira as though she had done something unnatural. She ignored him, her eyes still cold and distant. "It's nothing," Elira said, her voice calm again, though there was an edge to it. "Just a small trick I learned. It helps control people." Leo was speechless. He had never seen anything like that before. Elira's powers weren't something that could be learned from books or training. This was something deep within her. She wasn't just a skilled negotiator or a strong ruler. She had something much more powerful at her disposal. "Why didn't you tell me?" Leo asked, his mind racing. "This changes everything." Elira turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Because I don't need anyone else's help. I've been hiding this power because I didn't want anyone to know. I don't need to rely on humans or anyone else. My power is enough." Leo felt a mixture of awe and concern. Elira's power was extraordinary, but he knew it could be dangerous if misused. He had seen firsthand the devastation that could be caused by individuals who believed their abilities made them invincible. "This isn't a game, Elira," Leo said, his voice serious. "You can't just control people whenever you want. You can't make decisions for others with that kind of power. It will destroy you, and it will destroy everything around you." Elira's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned away and walked toward the balcony of the training room, staring out at the city below. Leo could tell that his words had struck a nerve, but he wasn't sure if they had gotten through to her. For the next few days, their relationship grew even more strained. Elira kept her distance from Leo, refusing to engage with him in lessons. Instead, she spent more time training with her powers in secret, always retreating to the quiet, isolated parts of the palace. She was becoming more withdrawn, and Leo could sense that she was struggling with something deep inside. One evening, Leo decided to confront her. He found her in the palace gardens, standing near a small pond, her face pale and tense. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the scene, but Elira seemed completely out of place in the calm beauty of the night. "I know you're hiding something," Leo said gently, approaching her. "You can't keep it locked away forever." Elira didn't look at him. "You wouldn't understand." Leo stood beside her, his eyes on the water. "Try me. I've seen a lot in my life. I've met people with power, with abilities that could destroy entire civilizations. But power like that doesn't fix things. It only makes them worse." Elira finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with frustration and confusion. "I don't want to be weak," she whispered. "I don't want to be like my mother, relying on others for everything. I can do it on my own." Leo placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do it alone. Your strength isn't in controlling people. It's in knowing when to ask for help, when to trust others, and when to choose a different path. That's what makes a true leader." Elira stared at him for a long moment, her face conflicted. For the first time, Leo saw a crack in her armor. She wasn't just a proud princess anymore. She was someone struggling to find her way, afraid of losing control, afraid of being weak. "I don't know if I can do that," she said quietly, almost to herself. Leo smiled slightly, trying to reassure her. "No one does at first, but you don't have to figure it all out right away. Just take one step at a time." Elira's gaze softened, and for the first time, she didn't seem so distant. The walls around her heart were starting to crumble, and Leo felt a small sense of hope. She might be difficult, she might be powerful, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to understand that true strength came from within, not from her powers. The following days were quiet, but the air between Leo and Elira felt different. Elira no longer ignored Leo entirely, though she still kept a distance. There was a hesitancy in her step, as if she were unsure whether she should trust him or not. But Leo wasn't giving up. He knew that there was more to her than the cold, proud princess who had refused to listen to anyone. One morning, as they walked through the palace grounds, Elira finally spoke. "You think I can change, don't you?" Her voice was softer than usual, but there was still a touch of uncertainty in it. Leo glanced at her, surprised by the question. "I think you can be whatever you want to be," he replied honestly. "But change takes time, and it takes effort. You don't have to be the person you were before. You can learn, and you can grow." Elira didn't say anything for a long time. She was staring straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the twin moons of her planet were rising. For a moment, Leo wondered if she was even listening, but then she turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something. Maybe answers, maybe reassurance. "I don't know if I can do it. If I can be what everyone expects me to be," she admitted quietly, her voice almost breaking. Leo stopped walking, and for the first time since arriving, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in Elira. It was a side of her that he hadn't expected, and it made him pause. She was the princess, the future ruler of a vast empire, And yet here she was, unsure of herself. "You don't have to be perfect, Elira," Leo said, his voice gentle but firm. "You just have to be true to yourself. And true leaders know when to admit their weaknesses. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not human. I'm a ruler, a princess. I don't have the luxury of being weak." "You're right. You're not human. But you're still a person. A person who has to learn how to lead with wisdom, not just power. And sometimes that means being honest with yourself and others." Elira was silent again, and Leo could feel the weight of her thoughts. She was struggling with something deep inside, and he knew that the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time, he saw a spark of hope in her eyes. Maybe she was starting to understand. That afternoon, Leo decided to take a different approach. He had been focusing so much on teaching Elira about diplomacy and leadership that he had forgotten one important thing. Elira needed to experience it firsthand. She needed to see the world from a different perspective, to understand how people thought and felt, and how their decisions impacted others. "Come with me," Leo said, his voice more determined than ever. "I want to show you something." Elira raised an eyebrow. "What is it now?" "Another lesson." Leo smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "Not exactly, but you'll see. Trust me." He led her to the nearby village, a bustling community where various species lived together in peace. It was a far cry from the royal palace, where luxury and power ruled every decision. The village was simple, but it was alive with energy. People worked together, helping each other without the expectation of reward. It was a place where trust and mutual respect were more important than anything else. Elira seemed skeptical as they approached the village center. "This is where you want to teach me about leadership?" she asked, clearly unimpressed. "You'll see," Leo replied. "Sometimes leadership is about listening and understanding. It's about seeing the people you lead not as subjects, but as individuals. It's about finding solutions together, not imposing your will on them." As they walked through the village, Leo stopped at a market stall. The vendor, a kind-looking alien with 3 arms, greeted him warmly. "Captain Lawson. It's been a long time." Leo smiled and exchanged a few pleasantries with the vendor before turning to Elira. "This is what I mean. People like him. He doesn't lead with fear or power. He leads with respect. And the people here trust him because he listens." Elira frowned, but she was paying attention. She watched as the vendor handed Leo a small, intricately carved piece of wood. "For you," the vendor said, "in appreciation for your kindness." Leo smiled and accepted the gift. "Thank you," he said, his tone genuine. As they continued their walk through the village, Elira started to notice the small things, the way the people interacted with one another, how they supported each other, and how they worked together to make their community thrive. It wasn't perfect, but it was a place where people took care of each other, where cooperation was more important than domination. After a while, Elira stopped and turned to Leo. "I think I understand," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "Leadership isn't just about strength. It's about finding a way to bring people together." Leo nodded, proud of her progress. "Exactly. And it's something that can't be learned from a book or from a lesson. It's something that comes from experience, from seeing the world through the eyes of others." Elira was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again, her voice softer. "I've always been taught that power is everything, that I should use it to control. But now, I see that maybe there's another way." Leo smiled, feeling a sense of relief. It was small, but it was progress. Elira was starting to realize that true strength didn't lie in control. It lay in understanding, compassion, and the ability to connect with others. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the village, Leo and Elira stood in silence, watching the people around them. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Leo felt confident that Elira was on the right path. The days after their trip to the village passed in a slow but steady rhythm. Elira seemed to have changed. Her arrogance, once almost suffocating, was beginning to soften. She still held on to her pride, but there was something different in the way she looked at the people around her, as though she were seeing them for the first time. Leo noticed the change and felt a sense of hope rise within him. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand the true meaning of leadership. But the real test of Elira's growth came sooner than either of them expected. One morning, a messenger arrived at the palace with urgent news. A neighboring planet, which had once been an ally, had suddenly cut off all communication and issued an ultimatum. They demanded that Elira's planet relinquish control of a vital trade route, or they would resort to war. The atmosphere in the palace grew tense as the news spread. Elira's mother, Queen Astrida, summoned her daughter to the throne room. Leo was there too, standing in the background as a silent observer. He knew that this moment would be a turning point for Elira. How she responded to this crisis would determine if she truly understood what it meant to lead. As Elira entered the throne room, she was met with her mother's piercing gaze. Queen Astrida was a woman of immense power and authority, her regal presence enough to make even the strongest of warriors hesitate. But there was no time for hesitation now. "What do we do, Elira?" Queen Astrida asked, her voice calm but firm. "Our allies are threatening war. We cannot simply ignore them." Elira stood tall, her back straight. For a moment, she looked every bit the princess, the future ruler of her people. But Leo could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had never faced a situation like this before, one where her decisions could lead to war or peace, life or death. Elira took a deep breath and looked at her mother. "I will handle this. We will not back down. I will send a message to their leader. If they want to test us, we will be ready." Queen Astrida raised an eyebrow. "And if they do not respond to threats? If they decide to go to war?" Elira's expression hardened, and for a brief moment, Leo saw the old Elira, the one who believed that power alone could solve any problem. She was about to say something, but Leo stepped forward, his voice calm but urgent. "Elira, this isn't the time for threats. This is the time to show wisdom," Leo said, his words carrying the weight of experience. "What you choose now will define your leadership. You cannot let anger or pride guide your decisions. If you do, you'll risk losing everything." Elira turned to him, her eyes flashing with frustration. "What do you know of leadership? You are just a human. I know that real strength comes from understanding, not from control. You have power, Elira, but it's not the only tool you have. You need to consider the consequences of your actions, the lives that are at stake. This is a time for diplomacy, not for threats." There was a long silence as Elira stood there, staring at Leo. It seemed as though she were weighing his words, struggling with the conflict inside her. Leo could tell she was torn, her pride and her sense of responsibility warring with the lessons he had taught her. Finally, Elira spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "You're right. I need to think carefully. I cannot act in haste." Queen Astrida, who had been silent during their exchange, now spoke, her tone surprisingly approving. "Good. If you are to rule, you must learn that decisions made in anger often lead to regret. We will send a diplomatic envoy to their planet and try to negotiate. If they refuse, then we will consider our options." Elira nodded, her resolve firming. "I will lead the envoy," she said, her voice clear. "I will show them that we are not weak, but we are not eager for war." Queen Astrida's expression softened slightly. "Very well. But remember, Elira, sometimes the strongest leaders are those who choose peace, even when war is within their grasp." As Elira left the throne room to prepare for her mission, Leo couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had listened. She had chosen diplomacy over power. It was a small step, but it was the right one. The next day, Elira stood at the front of a small delegation, ready to depart for the neighboring planet. She was dressed in formal attire, her shoulders squared and her expression resolute. For the first time since Leo had met her, she truly looked like a leader. "I'm nervous," Elira admitted to Leo as they stood near the ship's entrance. Leo smiled. "That's good. It means you care about the outcome. But don't forget, this is your moment. Lead with your heart, not with your fear." Elira nodded, her eyes steely. "I will. Thank you, Leo." With that, Elira and her envoy boarded the ship, and the engines roared to life. Leo watched as the vessel lifted off, carrying Elira toward the unknown. It was a daunting mission, but Leo felt confident that she was ready. This was the true test of her leadership, a test that would determine not only her future but the future of her people. As the ship disappeared into the sky, Leo couldn't help but think about the journey that lay ahead for Elira. She had come a long way since their first meeting, and though there was still much for her to learn, he knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the arrogant princess who believed power was everything. She had learned that leadership was about more than strength. It was about wisdom, compassion, and the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard. The journey to the neighboring planet was long and uncertain. Elira stood at the front of the ship, her hands clasped behind her back, staring out at the stars. The vastness of space stretched before her like an endless ocean, and for the first time in her life, she felt small. It was a humbling experience. Beside her stood Leo, his presence a steadying force. He had insisted on accompanying her on this mission, though Elira had not asked for it. She was grateful for his support, even if she wouldn't admit it outright. There was still a part of her that felt she had to prove herself, to show everyone that she could do this on her own. But deep down, she knew that Leo's wisdom and experience were exactly what she needed in a moment like this. "Are you ready?" Leo asked, his voice soft but filled with reassurance. Elira turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be." The mission was a delicate one. The planet they were headed to, Virelon, had once been a close ally of Elira's people, but recent tensions over trade routes had caused a rift. Virelon had issued its ultimatum, demanding control of the vital trade route in exchange for peace. If Elira couldn't convince their leader to back down, war could break out. The stakes were high, and Elira knew that her decision could shape the future of both planets. She had to remain calm, to listen, and to negotiate with care. Power alone would not win this battle. Diplomacy was her only weapon. As they landed on Virelon's surface, Elira took a deep breath. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She looked over at Leo, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. The tension in her chest eased slightly. They were escorted to the palace, a towering structure made of smooth, reflective glass. The palace looked as though it had grown out of the very ground itself, a stunning blend of nature and architecture. Elira couldn't help but marvel at the sight, though her mind was focused on the task ahead. Inside the palace, they were led to a grand hall where the ruler of Virelon, High Chancellor Xerxes, awaited them. He was a tall, imposing figure with sharp features and an air of arrogance that immediately put Elira on edge. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto her as she entered the room. "Princess Elira," Xerxes said in a deep, resonant voice, "I trust your journey was pleasant." Elira kept her composure, her voice steady. "Thank you, High Chancellor. The journey was uneventful. We come in peace, seeking to find a solution to our differences." Xerxes' lips curled into a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, yes. The trade route. I assume you understand that it is vital for the prosperity of both our worlds. Without it, we risk losing everything." Elira nodded, though she knew the Chancellor's words were laced with a sense of entitlement. "I understand the importance of the route, but I also believe that cooperation, not force, will benefit us both in the long run. We do not want war. We seek a peaceful resolution." Xerxes raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And what makes you think I will simply give up the advantage we have? Your planet's refusal to cooperate has already caused enough problems. You come here asking for peace, yet your people have made it clear that they have no intention of sharing control. Elira felt the sting of his words, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she stood taller, focusing on her training, on the lessons Leo had taught her. "We are not here to blame, High Chancellor," she said, her voice firm. "We are here to find a solution, to negotiate terms that will be fair to both sides. If we continue down this path of confrontation, we both lose. I believe there is a way for us to work together. We have more in common than you may think." Xerxes eyed her warily, his posture stiff with skepticism. He was not used to anyone challenging him, especially not someone of Elira's age and inexperience. He seemed to be weighing her words, deciding whether or not he could afford to let her live. Elira could feel the tension in the room, the quiet hum of energy that surrounded them. She had to be careful now. Any wrong move, any wrong word, and everything could fall apart. Leo stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "High Chancellor, the reality is that both of our planets need this trade route to survive. War will not solve anything. It will only lead to suffering. Princess Elira is here not as a conqueror, but as a leader who understands the value of peace. All she asks is that we sit down and discuss a way forward, one that benefits both sides." Xerxes' eyes flickered for a moment, but his expression remained unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Elira's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his response. It felt like an eternity. Finally, Xerxes spoke, his tone softer than before, but still filled with a sense of authority. "Very well. We will discuss this further. But know this, Princess. Your people have already tested my patience. This is your last chance to prove that peace is truly what you seek." Elira nodded, relieved that the conversation had not escalated into a direct threat. "Thank you, High Chancellor. I assure you, we want nothing more than to find a peaceful resolution." The meeting continued for hours, with Elira and Xerxes debating, discussing terms, and finding common ground. It was not easy, and there were moments when it seemed like the situation would unravel. But Elira held her ground, using the lessons she had learned and the wisdom she had gained from Leo. Slowly, they began to form a tentative agreement, a compromise that would allow both planets to share the trade route, with new regulations in place to ensure fair distribution. As they left the palace later that day, Elira felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The mission was far from over, but she had taken the first step towards securing peace. She turned to Leo, her eyes shining with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "You were right," she said quietly. "It wasn't about power. It was about finding common ground." Leo smiled, proud of her. "You did well, Elira. This is just the beginning." Elira's heart swelled with gratitude. She had taken a difficult step forward, but there was still much more to learn. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Elira felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't just the princess. She was a leader, and she was ready to prove it. After the successful negotiation with High Chancellor Xerxes, Elira returned to her home planet with a new sense of purpose. The journey had not been easy, but it had changed her. She was no longer the princess who relied solely on power. Now she was a leader who understood the true weight of her decisions. The future of her people rested on her shoulders, and for the first time, she felt ready to bear that responsibility. As the ship landed back at the palace, Elira stepped out, her heart pounding with anticipation. She was about to face her mother, Queen Astrida, who had been waiting for news of the mission. Leo followed closely behind, offering silent support. He had stood by her through every step of the journey, and now it was time for her to stand on her own. The royal court had gathered to hear the outcome. Queen Astrida sat at the throne, her expression unreadable, but there was a hint of expectation in her eyes. Elira took a deep breath and walked forward with confidence, knowing that her words would determine the next chapter of her reign. "Your Majesty," Elira began, her voice steady but filled with pride. "I have returned from Verilon with good news. The High Chancellor has agreed to share control of the trade route, and we have come to an agreement that benefits both of our planets." A murmur of approval ran through the court. Elira could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't let it distract her. This was her moment. Queen Astrida raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "You succeeded in diplomacy, then?" Her tone was not one of disbelief, but of curiosity. "Yes, Your Majesty. I learned that true leadership comes from understanding, not from domination. We don't have to control everything to be strong. Sometimes, the strongest leaders are those who can find common ground, even with their enemies." Queen Astrida studied her daughter for a long moment. Elira held her breath, waiting for her mother's judgment. Finally, the queen stood, her expression softening for the first time in a long while. "You have done well, Elira," Queen Astrida said, her voice carrying a weight of approval. "I admit I had my doubts, but you have proven that you are ready to lead, not with force, but with wisdom." Elira felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had earned her mother's respect, and that meant more to her than anything. But there was something else too, a sense of pride in herself. She had learned what it meant to be a true leader, and it was no longer about proving herself to others. It was about being true to herself and the people she served. Leo stepped forward, smiling at Elira. "You did it," he said, his voice full of pride. "You didn't just win the negotiation. You proved that leadership is about making the hard choices and staying true to what's right." Elira nodded, grateful for his guidance. "I couldn't have done it without you, Leo. You helped me see things in a way I never could have on my own." Her mother's gaze flickered between them, and for the first time, Elira saw a hint of understanding in the queen's eyes. "Leo has been a good influence on you," Queen Astrida said softly. "Perhaps there is more to learn from the humans than I first realized." Elira smiled at her mother's words. There was a new warmth between them, a shift that marked the beginning of a new chapter. For so long, Elira had struggled to meet her mother's expectations, but now she understood that the only way to lead was to be true to herself and to her people. Later that evening, Elira stood on the balcony of the palace, gazing out at the vast expanse of her planet. The twin moons hung in the sky, casting a gentle glow over the land below. The peaceful sounds of the night filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, Elira felt at peace with herself. Leo joined her, standing quietly beside her. "It's not the end," he said, his voice thoughtful. "There will be other challenges ahead, but you've learned to face them with wisdom, not just strength."